All right, welcome back, everybody. We are in, well, like I said last week, my favorite part of the semester, which is talking about persuasion. But really the thing up on the board is the kind of persuasion that gets me the most excited. That is persuasion that involves civic and community engagement. And normally I don't allow a whole lot of guest speakers to come in and talk to us about that. But Sarah and Ryan are here. They're both former public speaking students, and they want to talk to you about an opportunity that you have to do at least some civic engagement, and that is with the upcoming elections next week. They've assured me that their presentation will be short. They've also assured me that their presentation will be nonpartisan, but I will go ahead and turn it over to them so that they can talk to you.
Hi, so I'm sure you all know the election is in 8 days, and so typically students, especially at UND, have really low voter turnout. I believe in the last midterm it was like under 20%. So we really want to make sure that everyone knows how and where they're able to vote. So actually early voting starts tomorrow at the Alaris, and it goes until November 3rd, and it goes from 10 to 6 every day, except for on the 3rd it only goes until 3. But if you don't want to do early voting, you can also vote in person. If you live in the dorms, you're probably going to be voting at the Wellness Center. But if you live in like the Verge, you're probably going to vote at the Alaris Center. And then if you live at the Bowdoin, you'll most likely be voting, well, not most likely, you will be voting at the Public Works Commission. So then Ryan, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, so the one caveat to the dorms voting at the Wellness Center is anything south of University. So Johnstone, Fulton, and Smith, they will also be voting at the Public Service Commission, Public Works Commission, which is just on the other side of I-29, which is unfortunate that it's a little inconvenient. But voting in North Dakota is really simple. We're the only state in the union that does not require voter registration, which is something really quite cool about the state. However, you do need a North Dakota ID with your current address on it in order to vote here in Grand Forks. If you currently have a North Dakota ID that has your address from home, so you're from Fargo or from Watford City, all you have to do is go online to the Department of Transportation. They have an online portal where you can change your address, and you will be able to vote with that ID here in Grand Forks. It's a super simple process, takes less than 5 minutes. If you are a Minnesota voter, all you have to do is head up to the Department of Transportation on North Washington, just above Gateway, and all you gotta do is bring your Minnesota ID or your Montana ID or wherever you might be from, proof that you've lived here for 30 days, so something like a lease agreement or something like that, and a passport or birth certificate or another qualifying piece of identification. It takes 15 minutes. It's $15 to transfer your ID. It's super simple. Both of us did it, and it's really hassle-free. So that's a really great way for you to be able to vote here in this election, which is on the national scale extraordinarily important.
That's all that we have.
Yeah.
All right, thank you. Let's give them a round of applause. I don't know that they signed up to do a 300-person lecture, but both of them, as you saw, took public speaking and did pretty well with it, so thank you to both of them. Like we talked about with stasis theory, I am not here to tell you how to think, or what to think. I'm here to tell you how to think. Same goes for voting. I am not here to tell you who to vote for, but I am here to tell you that voting is one of your options for civic and community engagement, and I think it's important that we all exercise that option regardless of who you vote for. So we're going to go ahead and head into one of my favorite lessons, and that is the lesson on civic and community engagement. This is one of my favorite lessons because it's one of my favorite classes that I've ever taught. Back at Penn State, I taught a course called Foundations of Civic and Community Engagement. And when I taught that class, I didn't really think a whole lot about the title until the first day of class when I had my students wrestle with those terms. And I came to realize, I wish I could take credit for that title, but I came to realize that that title is actually one of the most brilliant titles for a course that I've ever seen, because it shows in the title for the course some of the big tensions that we spent the entire semester wrestling with, and some of the big tensions that anyone who engages in civic and community engagement wrestles with. And that is that there's one relationship between the civic and the community. Most public speaking textbooks that I've seen, if they talk about engagement, if they talk about public speaking of any kind for the sake of engagement, it's usually civic engagement. And it's usually in the realm of the civic, we're talking about the political. I really like the tension between the political and the social, or the civic and the community, because what I've noticed as a pattern is that Oftentimes when people feel like their politics is failing them, they turn inward toward communities. And so if you feel like the law has been written and your voice hasn't been heard, and maybe you're not being treated in the best way, a lot of people will find other people who think and act like them, and will find solidarity in that community, and will find other ways of making their voices heard. The same goes for when people feel like social structures are breaking down, when they feel like our communities aren't really working that well together. When we have communities that are at odds with one another and they're involved in disputes, a lot of people will turn back to the political. So that's one tension that's embedded in this course. Another one that was embedded within that is the tension between foundation and engagement. And foundations are things that we like to think of as stable. We like to think of them as things that are not capable of change, the things that we rest upon, the things that we go back to. If you think of a foundation to a house, it's that solid cornerstone that's going to keep the rest of the house standing. A lot of people like foundations because they like stability. In the United States, we have several foundations. We have foundational documents like the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution and our laws. We also have foundational institutions like the presidency and the Supreme Court and the U.S. Congress. At the same time, a lot of people like to use their voice to do engagement. They're not so comfortable with the status quo. They're not so comfortable with stability. And those are the kinds of people who are using their voice to make change. A lot of people get very frustrated with our politics and they want their voices heard, so they go out and they protest, they go out and they rally, they go out and they petition. There are lots of options available to you. And so I leave you the title of this course as a framework for how I want you all to think of using your voice in the context of civic and community engagement. Some of you will be afraid of some of those changes that other people are proposing, and I think rightly so. If we all agreed on everything, we probably wouldn't have politics. Oftentimes, whether we like it or not, we think of politics as a zero-sum game, and I'm inclined to not think of it that way. I'm inclined to think of ways that we can build bridges, work across the aisle. You may have noticed that I'm wearing a purple tie today. I did that intentionally to combat the partisan frames of red states and blue states that we often talk about in the United States. I think it's important for us to find ways to engage in ways that get beyond us versus them kinds of structures. But if you remember the title of your textbook, it's all about finding your voice. And your voice is going to have elements to it that are civic. Your voice is going to have elements to it that are community-based. Your voice is going to have, at sometimes, things that you want to keep the same and you're afraid of other changes that other people will make. And sometimes your voice will be the one making the changes. As we'll see later today with some examples that I'm going to pull up of people using public speaking in order to get their voices heard, a lot of people find themselves falling into civic or community engagement not because they want to, not because they're just naturally inclined to be annoying and to speak up and have their voices heard, but oftentimes because they have somebody or possibly themselves whose rights are going to be taken away. And they want to make sure that they can stand up and make sure that they are protecting themselves or protecting people that they care about. So some of you might not think of yourselves as politically, civically inclined or particularly community inclined, but it may happen that later on in life that you decide, hey, I can't be quiet anymore. I need to find my voice. I need to be able to speak up. And I want to make sure that if that time comes for you, that you're ready to do that. So let's talk about civic and community engagement. We have a lot of things that we've covered over the course of the semester, and some of you might be wondering, why is it that Brad's bothering to talk to us about this? Aren't professors supposed to be, to keep their politics out of the classroom? Aren't they supposed to be relatively disengaged? And I would agree with that. I hope that by the end of the semester, you don't know where I stand on a whole bunch of political issues. I try to keep my examples coming from different people, from different places. Nevertheless, I think it's important that if you are interested in civic or community engagement, that I give you the tools for that, regardless of whether you're right, left, or center, or completely independent. But there's a lot of things that are closely related to civic and community engagement that we've spent our time talking about. For the last 2 weeks, we've spent our time talking about persuasion. And I've tried to give you the tools to analyze when people are making bad arguments, when you yourself are making bad arguments. How do you use persuasion to make better arguments? I would encourage you to keep reviewing those materials and to keep practicing, because the more practice you have with persuasion, the better you'll get at it. Additionally, we could think about civic and community engagement in terms of the communication model. The communication model often tells us that the best kinds of messages are the ones that get transmitted easily from a source through a channel to a receiver, but it doesn't really tell us a whole lot with what that message ought to be or whether or not we ought to accept it. It doesn't tell us a whole lot about the content of that message and if that content happens to be political in nature, whether that content happens to be social in nature. Oftentimes we're trying to figure out how do we get that message across most effectively. Similarly, with the rhetorical situation, we're analyzing our exigence. Usually there's a political crisis that happens or a social crisis that happens. Who's in our audience and what can our audience do to make change, and what constraints might we face in terms of trying to create change? Sometimes there are actually political barriers that get in the way of what we want to do. Other times there are social barriers and it's inappropriate for us to try and have our voices heard. Nevertheless, most of the time people want to use the rhetorical situation to maximize their ability to have their voices heard. We've talked a lot about communication ethics in here. That, I think, is probably one of the most important, but also one of the most difficult lessons that we could have. Ethics often, unfortunately, go out of the window with civic and community engagement. I'm teaching you this today because I don't want them to go out the window. I want you to be reminded of who you might be hurting, who you might be helping, how you might be doing that with your communication, especially your communication around civic and political issues. We talked about free speech and responsible speech as a subset of communication ethics. We have a constitutional right to the First Amendment, which guarantees us free speech. That free speech, we could argue, is not necessarily totally unlimited. That free speech is mostly in legal protections to make sure that we don't get thrown in jail for exercising our right to speak. But nevertheless, we have a complement to that we could think of, and most of us would agree, there's something like responsible speech. And just because you can say something doesn't always mean that you should say something. Last but not least, I already mentioned the title of your textbook. I think the most important thing you all can do is to use public speaking to find your voice. And sometimes you'll find that voice and it'll have nothing to do with civic or community engagement. But sometimes you'll really want to use your voice to do that, and I want to make sure that you're able to speak well when you do. So we have actually a lot of topics in class that are very closely related to what we're talking about, and I think it's important that we spend some time looking at examples and wrestling with some key issues that accompany civic and community engagement, because I don't want you walking out of here thinking that I'm just giving you tools to give any kind of speech that you want, and you can make free reign of those tools and do whatever you want with them. So based on this description that I've already given you of civic and community engagement, I'm giving you your participation question today. I'm giving it to you a little bit early, recognizing that we ran a little short on time last week. And that question is to wrestle with the different kinds of possibilities for things that may or may not qualify as civic or community engagement. So what I want you to do is think, based on this description that I already gave you of the political and the social, or foundations and engagement, to talk about which one of the options up on the board might not qualify as civic or community engagement. I want you to think about which one of these doesn't quite count and why. So go ahead and log in. We are in week 11. Log into Blackboard. You have the whole rest of class to answer this question. But what I want you to do is answer which one of these doesn't count as civic and community engagement. And if you can, say why. I'm not going to necessarily expect your instructors to have that. But at least be thinking about it. Be prepared to discuss your answer with a classmate. Again, if you have any trouble getting into Blackboard, you can email your answer to your lab instructor. But take a second, think about these, and think about which one does not count. When you have your answer, what I'd like you to do is to turn to someone next to you and tell them which answer you chose and why. You can just put the letter on Blackboard. You don't need to write out the whole thing in full. But which one did you choose and why? I'm hearing some rumbling. That's a good sign. You might still be thinking about it, but I can tell the room's starting to go a little quiet again. Raise your hand if you chose A. Anybody? Raise your hand if you chose B. Quite a few people. Raise your hand if you chose C. Raise your hand if you chose D. A couple of you. Raise your hand if you chose E. Got one or two? Okay. Somebody tell me why you chose the letter that you chose. Be brave. You all are my quietest class. My other two are much more vocal, but you were comfortable saying it to each other. Go ahead.
I picked B because they don't take a stand.
Okay, so she chose B because they didn't take a stance. Were there other people who chose B who said something along the same lines? I chose B because they're not actually, taking a stance on a controversial issue. I could see why somebody would choose B for this one, and that is that oftentimes when we think of civic or community engagement, we think of making some kind of big change. But sometimes it could actually be that B is civic or community engagement based on the idea that, especially in a place like Grand Forks, which is unfortunately not very diverse, there are lots of people who have never met people from other countries. For instance, I teach graduate students, and about half of my graduate students right now are from Saudi Arabia. I haven't actually met someone from Saudi Arabia until I walked into my grad seminar on the first day of class. And I think there's actually something to be said about getting to know people from other cultures. I think if you talk to people who are hosting these nights, they would say, absolutely, we are engaging in community engagement. It may not be civic engagement, but we're trying to get other people to know us. And especially if we come from a country that's often stereotyped or people don't know a whole lot about, that can actually make a big change. Okay. Somebody else want to tell us a different answer that they chose here? Go ahead and be brave. I know you can do it. Go ahead, Brian.
I picked D.
Okay.
Because they're both, rather than they might be taking a stance, but they're not engaging directly in a conversation.
Okay.
Whatever they're reporting on, they're just reporting.
Okay, so we often think of journalists as being more or less objective. They're actually not supposed to really take a whole stand on a lot of things. They're usually supposed to be a little bit distant. They're not supposed to try and persuade people to vote a particular way or believe particular things. Is that sort of where you're coming from, more or less? Yeah, I think D is a common answer that I see in response to this question. A lot of people say that when journalists report on issues, they're supposed to be free of political bias. There's a couple of things that are a little bit challenging about that. One of them is actually a communication theory that some of you might learn about in other communication classes. That theory is known as agenda setting theory. And the theorists behind agenda setting theory say that it's not necessarily politicians' job, not journalists' job to tell you what to think, but it is their job to tell you what it is that you should be thinking about. That is, when journalists select which stories to report on, they are choosing those stories over other things that they possibly could report on, and they're telling you that those things are important. They're not going to tell you which side you should be on in a controversy, but sometimes they decide not to report on things that other people think are important, and that's political in nature. The other reason why I hesitate a little bit with D, if we zoom out to maybe the national scale, it used to be the case that everybody got their same news if they watched TV news or if they read the newspapers. A lot of people got their news from a limited number of sources. Toward the end of the 20th century, and especially at the beginning of the 21st century, we have a lot more options for what news we consume. One of my favorite things to do in my civic and community engagement class is to ask students, where do you get your news from? And it was usually a solid 5 minutes of talking and getting them away from saying, I get my news from some version of social media. I get my news from Facebook. I get my news from Twitter. And that's one answer that we could have, but when you're on Facebook or when you're on Twitter, where are you actually getting your news from? Do you pay close attention to the links of stories that are linked to your site? Do you recognize if there are certain sites that are a little bit more conservative or certain sites that are a little bit more liberal? Do you recognize and are you able to tell the difference between ones that report facts and ones that report alternative facts? Because sometimes it's not always entirely clear. And I'll tell you that there are, if you want to get into media ethics, there is actually kind of a monopoly on media ownership of traditional media in the United States. There's actually a map that you can pull up. There are 6 companies that own 90% of the traditional media that you consume. So if you're getting your news from local news affiliate stations like ABC or NBC, if you're getting your news from CNN, if you're getting your news from Fox News or MSNBC, those companies are owned more or less in a hierarchical structure. Most of them, you can tell if you're going to get a right-leaning story or a left-leaning story based on who owns that source. If you want to test this out, there's another feature that I'll tell you about, and that is something that the Wall Street Journal has. It's an option called red feed, blue feed. And you can actually pull this up if you want to get the same story reported in 2 radically different ways. It will show you what that story looks like if you have liberal-leaning sources or conservative-leaning sources. And you can tell that those are not going to tell the same story in the same way. If we're thinking at the stasis of fact or conjecture, we like to think that journalists are objective and that they don't have political or community leanings, but all of us are human beings. And sometimes we work for companies that tell us to lean one way or the other, and it's hard to get anything published if you don't. So that one's a little bit tricky. Let's see if we can get one more answer up here. We haven't gotten to it yet, so I'm curious if somebody else has a different thing that they would say does not count as civic or community engagement. I'm not just going to move on from this one, so somebody's got to be brave and speak up. I know it's hard to do that in a room with 300 people. Anybody else want to take one of the options we haven't talked about, whether that's A or C or E, and say why that's not civic or community engagement? I recognize option E is a little bit tricky after the events of the last week, so maybe somebody can go there. I'll prompt you a little bit. Why would somebody say option E is not civic or community engagement? Doesn't have to be your position, but why would somebody generally say that it's not civic or community engagement? Go ahead.
Rallies have a tendency to turn violent,
Okay.
and can lead to destruction of property.
Okay. So you would say anything that has a possibility of turning violent, once it turns violent, it's no longer in the realm of civic or community engagement. Is that more or less fair? Yeah, I think a lot of people would say that. I pulled up all 5 of these examples because these are things that came up regularly in the class that I taught and will come up regularly for those of you who do participate in these kinds of engagement. So you might be able to tell that this was a trick question. There's not an option up here that I don't think counts in some capacity as civic or community engagement. I want to go back to E for a second because that's probably the hardest one for me personally. I go back to E because, like our friend over there said, sometimes when things turn violent, some of us would say that by nature of being violent, it no longer counts as civic or community engagement. If we think about historical divisions between persuasion and coercion, it's very rare that we like to think of speech that turns to violence as engagement. We think of it instead as destruction, or we think of it instead as hate speech, or other categories like that. The reason why I put that one there, and I actually thought about taking it out after the events of the last week, is because a lot of times people will dismiss something as not qualifying as civic or community engagement because it's civic or community engagement that somebody doesn't like. Usually if I don't like the people who are rallying in Charlottesville, I'm going to say that they're doing kind of a perverse or an unfair version of civic or community engagement, and that doesn't count. Nevertheless, if we take the concept of free speech seriously, we still have to be able to account for other people's free speech rights, even if we disagree with them, even if members of the community might actually be actively trying to destroy my voice. There's a famous saying, I believe it's Louis Brandeis, I should have looked this up before class, but the cure for bad speech is more speech. It was a famous Supreme Court case. And a lot of people would say that if you don't like the kind of civic or community engagement that somebody else is engaging in, that you have a responsibility to find your voice and speak up. We could also talk about the same thing. A lot of people don't like that Colin Kaepernick has chosen to take a knee. There's a UND professor who recently published a book about Kaepernick taking a knee. There are a lot of people who are not happy with that and would say that it's an illegitimate form of protest. There are lots of other people who would come to his defense. Another big one that often came up in my class was whether social media activism counts as activism. There are a lot of people who have been studying social movements and how they work online. There are concepts that I've learned about called slacktivism and clicktivism. Slacktivism is essentially a null or a void kind of civic and community engagement. That is, you're acting like you're doing something, you're acting like you're making some kind of a difference, but all you're really doing is just raising awareness, or you're just spreading information. And a lot of people will engage in social media activism online so that they don't have to engage in it face-to-face. So there are a lot of critics who would say that if you're a slacktivist, it means that you're not taking civic or community engagement seriously, you're not doing the hard work of organizing petitions, organizing rallies, voting, whatever it happens to be. The perennial question that came up with online civic engagement, and this is something that will come up for a lot of you in your deliberations, is the question of raising awareness. At the stasis of definition, we have to ask ourselves, does raising awareness constitute engagement? If we answer that question yes, the other question we have to ask ourselves at the stasis of value is whether it constitutes sufficient engagement. That is, you might be doing something, you might be making something of a difference, but are you making enough of a difference, and how do you know? I'm not going to come down on one side or the other of social media activism. I think there are some movements that have been more successful than others, but nevertheless, it's an important question to ask in the 21st century. Now, aside from all of those issues, aside from that being a trick question, I share civic and community engagement with you to remind you all of what we talked about at the beginning of class, but also what we talked about just now. So some of you all, when you think of civic engagement, probably think mostly of voting. And a lot of you think, well, if you didn't vote, you don't get a chance to complain because you had a chance to have your voice heard and you chose not to exercise it. I want to remind you that civic and community engagement goes much more beyond voting. And I've pulled up to here the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. And it says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, no law prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, which is why we're talking about it here, or freedom of the press, journalism, or the right of people to peaceably assemble, or that's rallies and protests and things like that, and finally, the right to petition the government for a redress of grievances. You have lots of options that are available to you in the United States that are not available in other places in the world. Voting is something that we only do every 2 or every 4 years, but in that time in between, that often gets at that tension between civic engagement and community engagement. If you voted and that vote didn't go your way, a lot of people will turn to the Bill of Rights and will say, what are my other options for exercising my rights? What are my other options for having my voice heard? So that's just a reminder to you all that just because we have the right to vote in the United States, you also have lots of rights guaranteed in the First Amendment. One of those obviously is the freedom of speech, but also recognizing that sometimes people will choose to engage in these other amendments, and they have the right to do so under the U.S. Constitution, and sometimes you might not like the kinds of civic or community engagement that they're engaging in, but you also have these other options available to you. So that's just a reminder. Aside from that, when we're thinking about making change, whether that's political change or social change, I want to ask you, what does it look like? Who usually are the people who make change happen, whether that's politically or socially? Don't think too hard on this. Who's the first person or group who comes to mind with making change happen? See if I can get someone else. Who comes to mind? All right, go ahead. I'm sorry? Okay, so Martin Luther King Jr. Sometimes we go to political leaders. Martin Luther King comes to mind because he led the civil rights movement along with some other people. He's a famous figure that comes to mind. When you're thinking of politics, who else comes to mind? Yeah. Congress. Anybody else? Who has the most power to make decisions or get things done? Supreme Court. Anybody else come to mind? Yeah, oftentimes people will turn to the presidency and they'll say the president is the person who's able to make the most change. We often think of the president as being the leader of the free world and that they might be the most important person or most powerful person. Oftentimes we would say most powerful man, because up until this point we haven't had a female president. Nevertheless, when we think of civic or community engagement, a lot of undergrads don't think of themselves. You don't generally think that at 18 or 19 or maybe a little bit older than that, I know we have some returning students, you don't think that as a college student people are going to listen to you, people are going to take you seriously, that you can have a whole lot of impact or that you can make a whole lot of difference in the world. And I want to challenge you on that because there are a lot of people who didn't expect to fall into civic and community engagement. Some of them look a little bit different from you, some of them look a lot like you. But I want you to be able to realize that even at 18 or 19 years old, you have a lot that you can do with civic or community engagement. One of the people who comes to my mind is the woman up on the board here, and I don't expect any of you to know who this woman is, but this is a woman named Doris Haddock, and Doris Haddock passed away a few years ago. But in the early 2000s, actually 99 to 2000, she decided that she was going to do a particular kind of civic and community engagement. I would think she would identify as doing both of those things. Doris Haddock had been an activist for a lot of her life. She was fighting a lot against nuclear power and things like that. She had spent a lot of time fighting causes that she thought were important, but not the cause that she decided to make her own later in her life. So Doris Haddock is a 90-year-old woman. She is a grandmother. And she decided in the late 90s that she was turning 90 pretty soon. And her husband had passed away a few years ago. Her best friend passed away recently. And she said, you know, I don't have that much time left on this earth. There's something that I really want to do. So what did Doris Haddock do? Well, she said that she had had too much with money in politics. She decided that there was way too much money in politics and that money was really corrupt, and that a lot of politicians were essentially being bought and sold because in order to campaign, you need to raise a whole bunch of money, and in order to raise a bunch of money, oftentimes you need to turn to people who want favors in return once you're elected. And she said there's a lot of dirty money in politics. So she decided at 89 years old that she was going to walk. And she wasn't just going to walk down the street. She wasn't just going to walk to the state capitol. Doris Haddock, at almost 90 years old, decided that she was going to walk across the continental United States. So she was in North Dakota, she was in Texas, she was in California, she was in Washington, she was in New York. She decided to walk across the continental United States, pushing for something called campaign finance reform, that is, reforming how much money goes into politics. And so she decided to walk and raise support for her cause, and she had other people walking alongside her. She had this little banner that she carried around saying, Granny D for campaign finance reform. And she walked across the continental United States at 90 years old, ended her walk in Washington, D.C., made a big speech in the U.S. Capitol Rotunda, and something happened to her at the end of the conclusion of her walk. Does anybody want to guess what it was? I heard a couple people whispering something kind of morbid. Anybody want to say that a little louder? She died. No, she did not die. She did die about 10 years later, and we'll talk about that, but that's the possibility. That's where a lot of students go, so I'm not going to fault you for that or make you feel guilty about it. Anybody else want to guess what happened when she made her speech in the U.S. Capitol Rotunda? They ignored her. Fair possibility, not what happened. One more guess? Y'all are my quietest class. I'm going to pull this out of you at some point. Okay, they changed something. That is true, but it's true of a couple years later. What happened is actually Granny D gave a speech in the U.S. Capitol Rotunda, and promptly after she gave her speech, she was arrested. Anybody want to know why she was arrested? Because it's illegal to protest in the U.S. Capitol Rotunda, and I'm sure that Granny D knew that. She was pretty aware of her politics. She would identify as someone who was civic-minded. She probably went into that and planned to be arrested. About 4 years later, there was an act that passed, or 2 years later, there was an act that passed called the McCain-Feingold Act. That McCain-Feingold Act was an act for campaign finance reform to get some of the money out of politics. And that act passed, and when John McCain and Russ Feingold passed that act, they credited Granny D as part of the momentum for why they needed to pass a Campaign Finance Act. A few years after that, in 2010, there was a Supreme Court ruling called Citizens United. Does anybody know what Citizens United was? It's okay if we don't. Citizens United was a decision by the Supreme Court to reverse a lot of the McCain-Feingold Act and to allow for more money to go into politics. It's created what we now refer to as super PACs. Citizens United was decided in 2010. Doris Haddock unsuccessfully ran for Congress in the early 2000s in Wisconsin. She almost won. No, she didn't almost win, but 90-year-old woman decided after walking across the continental United States to run for Congress. In 2010, the same year that Citizens United was passed, or was ruled on by the Supreme Court, that's when Doris Haddock died. So she's one of those people who I kind of want to be when I grow up, and I kind of like talking about her, because I don't think at 90 years old that was her plan. In fact, a lot of her children, a lot of her close friends tried to talk her out of it. She wrote a book about it. She almost died a couple times on the journey. She still made it. But nevertheless, she's someone who I kind of would look up to as someone you wouldn't expect to get into civic or community engagement, who had found her voice throughout most of her life, but is probably most known for finding her voice at the end of her life. There's another person who I look up to, who I kind of want to be like when I grow up, and she's quite a bit younger than I am. She's about your age. Does anybody recognize the person up on the board here? Yeah, who is she? Good, Malala Yousafzai. And who's Malala Yousafzai? It's okay if we're not really sure. Yeah. She did recently win a Nobel Peace Prize. Does anybody know why? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, she has been fighting for the last few years to get more education for women around the globe. And Malala is somebody who's spoken up because you might remember a few years ago, she was the young girl who was shot in the head by the Taliban. Malala was writing for BBC Urdu in Pakistan. She lived in a region of Pakistan that was close to the Afghanistan border. And when the US entered into Afghanistan and Pakistan in order to root out the Taliban, a lot of them crossed that border into the region that Malala grew up in called the Swat Valley. And what happened in the Swat Valley is they started living life under Taliban rule. And if you know a lot about the Taliban, it was not inconsistent with how Malala was living her life. It was much more conservative. It was they didn't believe in women's right to get an education. They had lots of very strict Muslim laws in place. Malala decided she was going to write for BBC Urdu, critiquing what life was like under the Taliban. And as a result, she was going to school one day and she was shot in the head, as were two of her friends on the bus with her. Malala survived and has been an outspoken critic, trying to get more money and more support for women's education around the globe. Before she won her Nobel Peace Prize, she was invited on her 16th birthday after her recovery to speak in front of the United Nations. And we don't have time to watch her whole speech in here, but I'm hoping that realizing Malala's about your age will give you some inspiration that somebody like you, even if you're not shot in the head by the Taliban, could still have a voice and be heard.
Dear friends, on the 9th of October 2012, the Taliban shot me on the left side of my forehead. They shot my friends too. They thought that the bullet would silence us, but they failed. And out of that silence came thousands of voices. The terrorists thought that they would change my aims and stop my ambitions. But nothing changed in my life except this. Weakness, fear, and hopelessness died. Strength, power, and courage was born. I am the same Malala. My ambitions are the same. My hopes are the same. And my dreams are the same. I'm here to speak up for the right of education of every child. One teacher, one book, and one pen can change the world. Education is the only solution. Education first. Thank you.
Okay, so you might not be on the same international scale as Malala. She happens to be getting her undergraduate in the United Kingdom right now. But nevertheless, there are other people who look and sound a little bit more like you. I'm going to pull up another example here. I'll tell you that this example was a little bit controversial a few years ago. This is a young man from Iowa who happened to be an undergrad when the Iowa state legislature was proposing to have a ban on same-sex marriage. So this was before the Supreme Court ruling on that. But Zach Walls was a student at the University of Iowa. He decided that he was going to speak up in part because of his family solution. Again, I need to say that I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'm here to tell you how to think. We're watching this example not necessarily for the content of what he's saying, but nevertheless to see that somebody like you who didn't expect to fall into civic and community engagement can still speak up, be heard, and be taken seriously.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman. My name is Zach Walls, sixth-generation Iowan and an engineering student at the University of Iowa, and I was raised by two women. My biological mom, Terry, told her grandparents that she was pregnant, and the artificial insemination had worked, and they wouldn't even acknowledge it. It actually wasn't until I was born and they succumbed to my infantile cuteness that they broke down and told her that they were thrilled to have another grandson. Unfortunately, neither of them lived to see her marry her partner, Jackie, of 15 years when they wedded in 2009. My younger sister and only sibling was born in 1994. We actually have the same anonymous donor, so we're full siblings, which is really cool for me. And I guess the point is that our family really isn't so different from any other Iowa family. When I'm home, we go to church together, we eat dinner, we go on vacations. But we have our hard times too, we get in fights. Actually, my mom, Terry, was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis in 2000. It is a devastating disease that put her in a wheelchair, so we've had our struggles. But, we're Iowans. We don't expect anyone to solve our problems for us. We'll fight our own battles. We just hope for equal and fair treatment from our government. Being a student at the University of Iowa, the topic of same-sex marriage comes up quite frequently in classroom discussions. And the question always comes down to, well, can gays even raise kids? And the conversation gets quiet for a moment because most people don't really have an answer. And then I raise my hand and say, actually, I was raised by a gay couple. I'm doing pretty well. I scored in the 99th percentile on the ACT. I'm actually an Eagle Scout. I own and operate my own small business. If I was your son, Mr. Chairman, I believe it would make you very proud. I'm not really so different from any of your children. My family really isn't so different from yours. After all, your family doesn't derive its sense of worth from being told by the state, you're married, congratulations. No, the sense of family comes from the commitment we make to each other, to work through the hard times so we can enjoy the good ones. It comes from the love that binds us. That's what makes a family. So what you're voting here isn't to change us. It's not to change our families, it's to change how the law views us, how the law treats us. You are voting for the first time in the history of our state to codify discrimination into our Constitution. A Constitution that, but for the proposed amendment, is the least amended Constitution in the United States of America. You are telling Iowans that some among you are second-class citizens who do not have the right to marry the person you love. So will this vote affect my family? Will it affect yours? Over the next 2 hours, I'm sure we're going to hear plenty of testimony about how damaging having gay parents is on kids. But in my 19 years, not once have I ever been confronted by an individual who realized independently that I was raised by a gay couple. And you know why? Because the sexual orientation of my parents has had zero effect on the content of my character. Thank you very much.
So again, if you missed it, he was 19 when he gave that speech. From my understanding, he's currently running for Congress in Iowa. If that's not close enough to home for you, if you don't believe me that 19 or 20-year-olds can have a voice, this is my former student, Elijah. We're not going to watch Elijah speak, but I'll tell you his story. He's given me permission to share this with you. Elijah is a former student of mine who has epilepsy, and he was at a very fancy prep school in Florida, and they had really bad lighting in his math class, and pretty much at least once a week he would have a seizure. And the school told him and his family, we feel really bad, we're sorry for you, but there's nothing we can do to change the lighting, it's too expensive. And he, for a long time, has been fighting in court with that school. He actually won a lawsuit against them. They were in violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act. He has gone on to fight for education for other people who have faced discrimination in their education, whether that discrimination is based on race or whether they're survivors of sexual violence or whether they have different intellectual abilities. So he's still fighting. He's met with several Congress people. He's met with several former and current secretaries of education. So this is an actual student of mine who's going out there. He didn't expect to be so civically inclined, and now he can't help but be civically inclined. Well, that's going to take us to today's reading. And in the last couple minutes that we have, I just want to spend some time thinking about the relationship between civic and community engagement and violence. And the reason I go there is for the same reason that we went there earlier in class today, and that is that oftentimes when civic or community engagement turns to violence, a lot of people will think of it as illegitimate. So in ancient Greece, there were separations between the god of persuasion, Peitho, and the god of coercion or violence, Bia. And for the history of public speaking, a lot of people have said that public speaking or rhetoric is our best alternative to violence, and that never the two shall meet. Persuasion is in one category, violence is in another category, and we have to do our best to keep us separate because public speaking is our best alternative to violence. In the 20th century, we had some communication scholars who said, that's a little bit complicated. They started studying communication and persuasion from a social science perspective. And instead of thinking about persuasion, they started thinking of social influence. So if you think about the communication model, we have people who maybe have unintended consequences of their speech. They give a speech and people react to it in a way that they didn't plan on. Or sometimes they expect people to have a really strong reaction to their speech and it goes dead. And so there were a lot of social scientists in the 20th century who nevertheless said, we need to study not persuasion, but instead influence, when that persuasion isn't necessarily intentional. As an alternative persuasion, in the 20th century, you also have rhetorician Kenneth Burke. And after reading a lot of his work, I'm realizing more and more that a lot of what he was up to in his study of rhetoric was fighting against fascism or fighting against Nazism. And he said it's not necessarily about persuasion, but instead it's about identification. It's about how we recognize our common humanity and how we unite and divide ourselves based on how well people speak to us. Do we create communities of us and them? If we do, we usually, by nature of doing so, create antagonistic communities of us and them. And Burke is not necessarily convinced that we can have a whole human community where everyone just gets along and there's peace on earth. But instead, we have to be able to recognize how rhetoric is used to get people to think of themselves in in-groups and out-groups. Last but not least, we had your first reading for today, and that is persuasion versus what 20th century rhetorician Sonia Foss and Cindy Griffin called invitational rhetoric. Invitational rhetoric is an argument that says everybody should have a chance to speak. For the long history of people, the same people have been on top and the same people have been on the bottom. In order to make any difference, in order to make any change, we need to do away with the concept of persuasion entirely. And we just need to get everybody in the same room and treat each other as equals, and not necessarily to go in with the intent of persuading other people that they're right and everybody else is wrong, but instead really more to listen to one another, to have a conversation, to have each other's voices heard. And for a lot of persuasion scholars, that was something that they were very excited about, and they wanted invitational rhetoric to be something that would create more equality among people. That's where our second reading for today comes in, and our second reading is Dana Cloud and Nina Lozano-Reich talking about the idea that invitational rhetoric, that idea that if we just get everybody at the table, that they'll all just get along and be okay. And the idea comes from this binary that I have up here between the civic and the civil. It's what we were talking about earlier, that when people cross that line into incivility, what often happens is other people dismiss their civic engagement as invalid, illegitimate, nonsensical. What Cloud is saying instead is actually we have this culture of Minnesota or North Dakota nice, and before I stereotype too much, I want to remind you all that I'm from this region. I grew up in this culture. I don't want to pick on it too much, but we have this culture in Minnesota and North Dakota that says if you want to participate in civic or community engagement, that you have to do it in particular ways. You shouldn't be too loud. You're not supposed to talk about things that are too controversial. You're not supposed to get too political. You're not supposed to challenge your relatives at Thanksgiving. Driving around the state, you might have seen these billboards that say things like, be nice, be polite, bullying hurts. A lot of people from outside of this region look at that culture of civility and say it's not just Minnesota or North Dakota nice, it's Minnesota or North Dakota passive aggressive. And that we can't solve issues that are challenging like racism or sexism or various isms and phobias without getting in people's faces. That if we pretend that those things exist, if we're not supposed to talk about them and we just passively aggressively critique them, then we have these power relations that are nevertheless standing, even though we might be fighting them a little bit passive-aggressively. What I'll tell you and what you should understand about Dana and Nina's article is probably best summed up in the first time that I met Dana Cloud. I met her at a conference on civility and violence a few years ago. She was giving a talk on civility, and behind her the whole time that she was talking was this. What Cloud is saying and what her critique of invitational rhetoric is that if invitational rhetoric is supposed to take those power relations and make them equal, they're never actually equal. Those power relations are there whether we want them there or not. And I want to encourage you to not be so Minnesota or North Dakota nice when you have issues that you care about. Don't be afraid to speak up politically. Don't be afraid to engage. I'll leave you with a thought from Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was a dissident fighting against the Nazis who died in one of the death camps. And he said, "Not to speak is to speak. Not to act is to act." So you might not find yourselves in a position where you want to be civically or community engaged right now. My hope is that if you find yourself in that position, that I'm giving you the tools to be ready to do that. So I'll leave you on that thought, and I'll see you all next week.